On a barrier island in Newport, Rhode Island, there stands a mansion built on solid coral where the Atlantic Ocean crashes against jagged rocks. Rough Point, 49 rooms of red sandstone and granite, designed in 1892 by architects who understood that wealth demands permanence. 10 acres stretching from Bellevue Avenue to the Cliff Walk. Gardens laid out by the same firm that created Central Park. The entrance hall rises 2 stories high. Gothic arches frame doorways wide enough to drive carriages through. The walls are thick enough to withstand hurricanes. The solarium overlooks the ocean through 40 feet of glass. The gates at the property's edge are wrought iron, massive, designed to open inward. On the evening of October 7th, 1966, those gates were bent, torn from their moorings by 2 tons of Detroit steel, moving at high speed. Eduardo Tirella died on Bellevue Avenue that night, 42 years old, designer to the wealthy. Friend to Sharon Tate and Richard Burton, his body was found beneath a station wagon, crushed against a tree. The woman behind the wheel was Doris Duke, at that moment the richest woman in America. The police called it an unfortunate accident. They closed the case in 5 days. The first officer at the scene believed it was murder. A 13-year-old paperboy heard 2 distinct impacts and a scream that turned to horror. Decades later, one of Duke's lovers would reveal that she confessed to the killing. But in October of 1966, none of that mattered. Doris Duke had enough money to rewrite what happened at her gates, and for 55 years, the official story held. This is what really happened, and why it took half a century for the truth to surface. Chapter 1. The Vanderbilts' Rough Point. The first stone was laid in 1887 on a point of land where the Atlantic meets the Rhode Island coast with particular violence. Frederick William Vanderbilt, 6th son of William Henry Vanderbilt, had purchased 2 parcels of raw acreage on Bellevue Avenue, Newport's emerging address for industrial wealth. He commissioned the Boston architectural firm of Peabody and Stearns to design something substantial, not a cottage, a manor. The architects chose red sandstone and granite, materials that could withstand salt air and nor'easters. Construction continued through 5 years. Workers dynamited through coral foundation to anchor the structure against storms. The exterior walls rose thick. The entrance hall climbed 2 stories, topped with Gothic arches that framed carved wood and leaded glass. The New York Sun visited during construction and published a joke that would follow the house for decades. One could take one's morning walk around the entrance hall, assuming one was in rude health and good physical training. The estate stretched across 10 acres from Bellevue Avenue west to the cliff edge. Frederick Law Olmsted's firm, fresh from designing Central Park, laid out the gardens. They planted according to the natural contours, preserving the dramatic drop where land met ocean. The landscape moved from manicured lawns near the house to wilder growth approaching the rocks. Native bayberry mixed with imported specimens. Paths wound through the property, offering views in both directions, the avenue on one side, the Atlantic on the other. The house was completed in 1892. Frederick and Louise Vanderbilt named it Rough Point for the waves that crashed without pause against the rocks below. The name was accurate. This was the roughest point on an island that had become America's summer capital for a particular class of wealth: railroad money, steel money, tobacco money, all of it flowing into Newport, all of it building monuments to permanence. Rough Point distinguished itself through scale and position. 49 rooms filled the main structure. Service wings extended outward, housing staff quarters, kitchens, storage for the linens and silver and china required to maintain a house of this magnitude. The second floor contained bedrooms for family and guests. The first floor was designed for entertainment and display: the great hall, the dining room, parlours decorated with European antiques and American ambition. The Vanderbilts occupied Rough Point through the 1890s and into the new century. Then, in 1906, they sold. The buyer was William B. Leeds, known in industrial circles as the Tin Plate King. Leeds had built his fortune in steel manufacturing, specifically in the tin-plated sheets used for canned goods. He understood the same principle that had drawn the Vanderbilts to this location: wealth required demonstration. Leeds made minor alterations. The facade received cosmetic updates. The entrance drive was redesigned, but the fundamental character of the house remained unchanged. Rough Point was what it had been built to be: a display of resources so vast they could be spent on a summer residence that sat empty 9 months each year. William Leeds died in 1908. His widow, Nancy Stewart Leeds, lived in the house through the teens and into the 20s. Then she too decided to sell. The buyer, in 1922, was a man whose fortune made even the Vanderbilt and Leeds wealth look modest. James Buchanan Duke had founded the American Tobacco Company. He had consolidated the Duke Power Company. He owned mills and real estate and held stock positions in enterprises spanning 2 continents. When he purchased Rough Point, he paid in cash. The exact figure was never disclosed, but Newport society understood that Duke had the resources to buy the entire island if the notion occurred to him. He hired Horace Trumbauer, one of the era's most sought-after architects, to renovate. Trumbauer added a solarium that would become the house's signature feature: glass panels 40 feet across, arching overhead to frame an unobstructed view of the Atlantic. The room was positioned on the ocean side of the mansion, creating a space where one could sit surrounded by imported orchids and watch winter storms roll in across black water. The renovations were completed in 1923. James Duke had 1 year to enjoy them. On October 10, 1925, he died at his New York City mansion, pneumonia, complicated by a lifetime of cigar smoke and the kind of stress that comes from managing empires. He was 59 years old. His entire fortune, every property and stock certificate and parcel of land, passed to his only child. Doris Duke was 12 years old. The girl who inherited Rough Point inherited something else as well. A warning her father had given her from his deathbed. 3 words that would shape every relationship she ever had: trust no one. Chapter 2. The Richest Little Girl in the World. Doris Duke was born on November 22, 1912, in New York City. Her father was 41 when she arrived, already wealthy beyond measure from tobacco. Her mother, Nanaline Holt Inman, was a Southern aristocrat, a widow who had brought social standing to match James Duke's money. Doris was their only child. From birth, she was treated as an adult. From birth, she was also a target. The newspapers called her the $1 million baby. They called her the richest little girl in the world. Every milestone became news. First steps, first words. The family tried to shield her, employed bodyguards, kept her movements private. It didn't matter. Wealth on this scale made privacy impossible. James Duke doted on his daughter in the manner of men who built empires with absolute control and specific instruction. He took her to board meetings when she was 10. He taught her to read financial statements. He wanted her to understand that money was not ornament. It was power, and power required vigilance. He also taught her to be suspicious. The world, he explained, was full of people who would smile while reaching for what belonged to her. On his deathbed, with pneumonia filling his lungs and the doctors standing uselessly nearby, James Duke pulled his 12-year-old daughter close. His last coherent words to her were 3: trust no one. He died hours later. The estate went to probate. The accounting took months. When the final numbers emerged, Doris had inherited $100 million. In 1925, currency, the equivalent, in modern terms, of $1.5 billion. The inheritance included the American Tobacco Company stock, Duke Power Company holdings, real estate spanning 4 states, and 3 primary residences, Duke Farms in New Jersey. A 2,700-acre estate with greenhouses and gardens, the Manhattan Mansion at 1 East 78th Street, and Rough Point in Newport. Doris also inherited something her father had hidden from her: bags of mail stored in a locked room containing death threats, ransom demands, letters from strangers who believed a child with that much money had no right to exist. She read them all, every threat, every demand, every expression of hatred from people who had never met her but knew her fortune down to the dollar. The experience calcified something in her. Her father had warned her to trust no one. The letters proved he was right. At 14, she sued her own mother. Nanaline Duke had begun selling family assets, claiming the need to convert holdings into liquid capital. Doris, advised by lawyers who understood her father's will better than her mother did, filed suit to stop the sales. The case exposed the arrangement James Duke had created. Nanaline received only a small trust fund. The bulk of everything went to Doris. Mother and daughter never recovered from that courtroom battle. They maintained appearances. They travelled together. But the relationship had broken, and both of them knew it. Doris grew up surrounded by wealth and utterly alone. She attended private schools where other students either fawned or avoided her. She had servants but not friends. She had suitors by the dozen, all of them transparently interested in her money. She learned to watch people the way her father had taught her to watch markets, looking for the moment they revealed what they really wanted. At 17, 6 feet tall and self-conscious about her height, she was presented to Newport society at a debutante ball held at Rough Point. The house had been closed since her father's death, shuttered and maintained by a skeleton staff. For the ball, it was reopened. Flowers filled the entrance hall. Musicians performed in the great room. The guest list included every significant family in Newport. Doris wore white. She danced. She smiled. She fulfilled the role required of her. The newspapers covered it as theatre, the richest girl in the world, on display. The fortune made her the season's most eligible prospect, despite her height, despite her visible discomfort with the attention. Men proposed. She declined them all. She married in her early 20s, divorced within years, married again, divorced again. The details are less important than the pattern. She could not trust anyone, and anyone who got close discovered that her money came with strings, control, surveillance, the certainty that leaving would carry consequences. In 1938, the Great New England Hurricane struck Rhode Island. The storm devastated Newport, tore buildings from foundations, reshaped the coastline. Rough Point survived. The thick walls and coral foundation held. But Doris stopped visiting regularly after that. The house reminded her of something she preferred to avoid, that even wealth couldn't control nature. Through the 1940s and into the 50s, Rough Point stood mostly empty. Doris lived in New York, travelled constantly, collected art compulsively. She filled her other residences with treasures acquired from around the world: Ming Dynasty porcelain, French furniture, Russian imperial artifacts purchased from the Soviets, desperate for hard currency. She bought not just objects but entire rooms, dismantled in European palaces and reassembled in her American estates. Rough Point, meanwhile, sat dark. In the early 1950s, she had it emptied entirely. Every piece of furniture, every painting, every object removed. The house became a shell. Staff came weekly to dust rooms containing nothing but echoes. Then, in 1958, something shifted. Doris Duke, now in her mid-40s, returned to Newport. She ordered Rough Point refurnished. The art collection from her Manhattan mansion was packed, shipped, installed in the Newport house. She began acquiring pieces specifically for these rooms, consulting with designers, spending hours in the Trumbauer solarium with catalogues spread across her desk, planning the next acquisition. The solarium became her command centre, 40 feet of glass overlooking the Atlantic. She positioned her desk to face the water, surrounded herself with orchids, and made decisions about art worth tens of millions. She was building something, or perhaps rebuilding something. The house that had stood empty, now filled with objects she controlled completely. The pattern was established obsession, then abandonment, then obsession again. Rough Point cycled through these phases according to Doris Duke's needs. When she wanted control, she filled it with beautiful things. When control failed, she walked away. In 8 years, the house would witness death. In 8 years, Doris Duke would fill those gates with violence. But in 1958, Rough Point was simply a mansion being prepared for its final, most dramatic chapter. Chapter 3. Rough Point becomes a stage. The debutante ball in 1929 had been performance. Doris Duke understood, even at 18, that wealth required demonstration. The house had been staged for that night, flowers, musicians, guests who represented Newport's highest social tier. She had played her role, then she had moved on. But Rough Point was more than a stage, it was a tool. Throughout the 1930s, before the hurricane drove her away, Duke used the house as her mother had taught her for entertaining that served strategic purposes. Business associates of her father's companies, politicians whose votes might affect her holdings, artists and musicians she wanted to patronize. The guest list was never random, every invitation calculated. The house supported this perfectly. The great hall could accommodate 100 people without feeling crowded. The dining room sat 40. The guest bedrooms allowed visitors to stay for weekends, creating time for conversations that couldn't happen in offices or over lunch. Newport in summer was informal compared to New York. Guards could be dropped. Or at least, they appeared to drop. Doris never dropped hers. She watched. She listened. She catalogued what people revealed when they thought charm had won them access. She learned that trust was weakness, that intimacy was leverage, that everyone wanted something. After the hurricane, after the years of abandonment, the 1958 return marked a different relationship with the house. She wasn't performing for Newport society anymore. She was building something private. The art she installed wasn't for guests to admire. Much of it she kept in rooms that visitors never entered. She was curating her own museum, her own palace, according to standards only she understood. The solarium became her favourite space. Trumbauer had designed it to capture light, to create the illusion that the ocean extended into the house itself. Duke positioned furniture to take advantage of this: a desk, chairs for reading, tables for spreading documents and catalogues. She spent entire days there, planning which pieces to acquire next, which buildings in Newport to save from demolition. In 1968, she would found the Newport Restoration Foundation, an organisation dedicated to preserving the city's colonial architecture. She would save more than 80 buildings from destruction, spend millions on restoration, reshape the historic district. But in the late 50s and early 60s, that work was still forming. She was still deciding what legacy she wanted beyond the tobacco money and the power company profits and the accumulation of beautiful objects. She filled Rough Point room by room: Renoir, Gainsborough's, Van Dyck portraits, Chinese porcelain that predated European contact, French furniture that had survived the revolution. Each acquisition was researched, authenticated, purchased, installed. She hired designers to advise her, but the final decisions were always hers. The house was becoming what she wanted it to be, a testament to taste, to connoisseurship, to the fact that wealth could create beauty if directed properly. She also hired staff, not the skeleton crew that had maintained the empty house, but a full complement: cooks, housekeepers, groundskeepers, drivers, security. She needed a small army to keep Rough Point functioning at the level she demanded. Most of them came from West Palm Beach, crossing each day to work in an environment that required absolute discretion. What happened in the house stayed in the house. Duke made that clear. Among the hires were designers, men and women who understood her aesthetic, who could source the pieces she wanted, who travelled with her to Europe and Asia scouting for treasures. These relationships were professional, transactional. Duke paid well. She expected perfection. She tolerated no independence. In 1959, she hired a designer named Edoardo Tirella. He was 35, Italian-American, gay in an era when discretion was survival. He had worked in Hollywood as a set decorator, had connections to actors and directors, understood how to create spaces that looked effortless but were meticulously planned. Duke saw his work and offered him a position that would change both their lives. He would curate her art. He would design interiors for all 5 of her estates: Duke Farms in New Jersey, the mansion in Bel Air, Shangri-La in Honolulu, the New York residence, and Rough Point. He would travel with her, advise her on purchases worth tens of millions, transform her houses into showcases. The salary was generous, $43,000 a year, the equivalent of $355,000 in modern currency. More than most Americans could imagine. The job came with a cost. Tirella belonged to Doris Duke. His time, his expertise, his aesthetic judgment. She consulted him on everything. She valued his opinion. She also made it clear that leaving would be difficult. For 7 years, he stayed. He transformed Duke Gardens, the greenhouse complex in New Jersey, into one of the finest botanical displays in the country. He sourced furniture from French estates, tapestries from Italian collections, art from dealers across Europe. He made Rough Point into the house. Duke envisioned a palace that combined American ambition with European refinement. But he had other ambitions. His Hollywood career had been interrupted, not abandoned. He maintained friendships with actors. He kept connections to directors who needed set designers for major productions. And by 1966, those connections were paying off. He had worked on The Sandpiper with Elizabeth Taylor. He had designed sets for Don't Make Waves, a film starring Tony Curtis and Sharon Tate. His Hollywood career was beginning to catch fire. He wanted to leave. He wanted to return to California, to pursue the work that would make him famous for his own achievements, not just as Doris Duke's curator. He knew it would be difficult. Duke did not accept departure well. Her history with relationships followed a pattern obsession, control, and when control failed, consequences. But Tirella believed he could handle her. He had spent 7 years managing her demands, her moods, her expectations. He thought he understood her. He thought professional competence would protect him. In October of 1966, he returned to Newport one final time. Duke had called him back to authenticate a piece of art. She wanted to purchase a reliquary containing the bones of a 4th century saint. It was, he thought, his last curatorial job for her. After this, he would be free. He was wrong. The house that had cycled through obsession and abandonment was about to witness what happened when Doris Duke lost control of something she believed she owned. Rough Point had been built to last forever. It would outlast everyone who passed through its doors. But what happened at those iron gates on October 7th would haunt the mansion for decades. The truth would be buried. Then, 55 years later, it would surface. The house was waiting. It had always been waiting. Chapter 4. The Renaissance Man. Edoardo Tirella was born on June 8, 1924, in Dover, New Jersey. The youngest of 9 children, 5 sisters, 3 brothers, Italian-American, in an era when that still marked you as ethnic, as other, as someone who had to work twice as hard to earn half the respect. His family was working class, factory wages, tight budgets, the kind of household where talent was the only route out. Tirella had talent. He designed hats first, millinery work that caught attention in New York circles, then performance, then interior design. By the time World War II arrived, he had established himself as someone who understood aesthetics, who could create spaces that felt both elegant and lived in. When he returned from the war, a veteran now, he took those skills to Hollywood. He became a set decorator. The Sandpiper, a 1965 film starring Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, featured Tirella's work creating Taylor's beach house. The sets looked natural, uncontrived, as if the characters actually lived in these spaces rather than performing in them. Directors noticed. Don't Make Waves, released in 1967, gave him more prominent credit. He appeared in cameo roles in both films. His circle expanded to include Sharon Tate, Tony Curtis, David Niven, people who could open doors, But Hollywood was expensive and uncertain. When Doris Duke offered him steady employment at $43,000 annually, Tyrrell accepted. The job meant leaving California, meant dividing his time between Duke's 5 estates, meant answering to a woman known for demanding absolute loyalty. He accepted anyway. 7 years of financial security would give him the foundation to return to Hollywood on his own terms. The work suited him. Duke had impeccable taste and unlimited resources. She wanted the best, and she paid for it. Tyrrell travelled with her to London, to Paris, to Italy. They scouted paintings, tapestries, furniture from aristocratic estates. He advised on purchases worth tens of millions. Duke, at the 1971 trial, would testify that she always asked Eduardo's advice before buying or planning anything for her estates. They acquired together more than 100 times. The relationship was professional but close. Duke valued his judgment. She trusted his eye. For someone who had been taught to trust no one, this was significant. Tyrrell became part of her inner circle, the small group of people allowed to see beyond the public performance. But he was also gay, and Duke was possessive. Their relationship had boundaries that both understood, but neither discussed. He had a partner, Edmund Cara, a prominent wood sculptor. Cara knew Duke's reputation. He knew the stories about what happened to people who tried to leave her employment. 3 years before Tyrrell's death, Duke had stabbed a man with a butcher knife. The victim was Joseph Castro, a jazz musician Duke had lived with for years, common-law husband in every sense except legal. Castro was talented, a pianist and vibraphonist who performed with his band across the country. Duke sometimes joined them on stage, wearing disguises, playing piano under the stage name Dolly Strayhorn. She loved jazz. She loved performing. She loved Castro, until she didn't. The details vary depending on the source. One account says Castro made a wisecrack while Duke was playing piano. She was drinking. She was in a mood. Whatever he said triggered something in her. She attacked him with a knife, causing injury that required medical treatment. Castro sued for assault. Duke had enough lawyers to make the lawsuit disappear. According to later testimony, she had Castro kidnapped in Hawaii, pressured him to drop the case. He did. No criminal charges were filed. Duke faced no consequences beyond the reputation damage among people who knew what had happened. The lesson was clear. Doris Duke could commit violence and walk away. Money insulated her from accountability. The right lawyers, the right connections, enough pressure applied in the right places, and the legal system bent. Eduardo Tyrrell knew this story. His partner knew it. His friends in Hollywood knew it. When he decided to leave Duke's employment in 1966, they warned him. Don't test her. Don't give her reason to feel abandoned. Among Duke's circle, there was a saying, "No one leaves Doris Duke without consequences." Tyrrell assured them he could handle it. He had spent 7 years managing her moods, her expectations, her need for control. He would be professional. He would finish his current obligations, recommend a replacement, make the transition smooth. He was going back to Hollywood to pursue set design full-time. His career was catching fire. He had opportunities waiting. On October 6, 1966, he flew into Newport. Duke picked him up at the airport. They drove to Rough Point. He had come to authenticate one final piece for her collection, a reliquary carved in 1500, containing the bones of Saint Ursula, a 4th century Christian martyr. The object was for sale at the Black Cat, a Newport antique shop. Tyrrell would examine it, give his professional opinion, and then tell Duke he was leaving. Servants at Rough Point remembered hearing them argue that afternoon, shouting, voices raised in the kind of fight that carries through thick walls. Tyrrell had told her. Duke had not taken it well. They were scheduled to drive to the Black Cat around 5 o'clock. Duke had rented a 1966 Dodge Polaris station wagon from Avis, 2 tons of Detroit steel. Tyrrell drove. Duke sat in the passenger seat. They left Rough Point through the main gates, massive wrought-iron structures that opened inward. What happened next would be disputed for 55 years, but the physical evidence, the witness testimony, and Duke's own later confession to a lover tell a story that contradicts the official police report. The official version, an unfortunate accident. A woman who mistook the gas pedal for the brake. The truth murder. Chapter 5, October 7th, 1966, 5:23 in the afternoon, autumn lights slanting across Bellevue Avenue. Eduardo Tirella put the Dodge Polara in park 15 feet from Rough Point's iron gates. He opened the driver's door, stepped out into cool air. The gates opened inward, toward the property. Standard procedure, someone had to exit the vehicle, open the gates manually, then the driver would pull through. Doris Duke sat in the passenger seat, 53 years old, making $1 million a week in interest on her fortune. She watched Tirella walk toward the gates. Then she slid into the driver's seat. She released the parking brake by hand. She shifted into drive. She pressed the accelerator. The rear tires spun in the gravel driveway, leaving gouges 1.5 inches deep. The station wagon roared forward from a dead stop. 30 feet of gravel torn by tires, accelerating far harder than any accidental depression of a pedal would create. Tirella heard the engine. He turned. The 2-ton wagon was coming at him at speed. He jumped, got his hands on the hood, went up onto the vehicle as it smashed through the gates, bending the heavy iron, tearing the massive structures from their moorings. He was on the hood, staring through the windshield at Doris Duke, terrified. The wagon burst through the gates and onto Bellevue Avenue. Then Duke hit the brakes, not hard, a tap. The wagon decelerated slightly, enough for Tirella to roll off the hood. He hit the pavement in the middle of Bellevue Avenue. He was alive, injured, but alive. Duke accelerated again. The roar of the engine, the scream, a man's voice turning to horror, forming a single word, no. The station wagon ran over Eduardo Tirella, dragged him across Bellevue Avenue, smashed through a fence, and crashed into a tree. He was killed instantly. This is what Sergeant Fred Newton concluded within hours of arriving at the scene. Newton was the Newport Police Department's chief accident investigator. He examined the tire marks in the gravel. He measured the distance from the gates to where physical evidence was found in the street. He noted that all of Tirella's fatal injuries were to his upper body and head, not his lower body. He concluded that Tirella had not been crushed against the gates, as the later official story would claim, but had been struck twice, once inside the property, sending him onto the hood, then again in the street, after he rolled off. The pause between impacts suggested deliberation. The heavy acceleration from a dead stop suggested intent. Newton believed he was looking at a homicide. Officer Edward Angel arrived first, 24 years old, a rookie with about a year on the job. He got the call around 5 o'clock motor vehicle versus pedestrian, Bellevue Avenue. When he arrived, he found a body beneath a station wagon, a woman with blood on her face standing nearby, and a crowd beginning to gather. The gates were destroyed, the lower rungs bent and torn. Parts of the iron scattered across the road. Angel collected them as evidence. He photographed the scene. He took measurements. He noted the tire marks, the position of the vehicle, the location where the body came to rest. Doris Duke was taken to Newport Hospital. Shortly before the assistant county medical examiner arrived, Duke hired him as her personal physician. When he arrived to treat her injuries, everything she told him was already protected by doctor-patient privilege. State investigators who wanted to question her that night were turned away. The doctor insisted she needed rest. 13-year-old Bob Walker was delivering the Newport Daily News on his bicycle when he heard the argument. 2 people screaming at each other. Then the roar of a motor, a crash, a man screaming, the sound of tires skidding, decelerating slightly. A pause, the man beginning to scream again, the roar of the motor rising, the scream turning to horror. No, another crash. Walker arrived at the scene just after the final impact. He saw Duke exit the car. She moved to block his view of what was beneath the wagon. He asked if she wanted help, if he should call police. She screamed at him to leave. Walker rode away. When he got home, he told his father what he had heard. His father, understanding things that 13-year-old boys don't, gave his son specific instructions. Do not go to the police. Do not tell anyone what you heard. Duke is a dangerous woman. She has dangerous people working for her. Speaking up will get you hurt. Walker stayed silent for 55 years. Judith Tomaso, a newly commissioned naval ensign and nurse stationed at Newport, was with her parents preparing for a sightseeing drive when the crash occurred. She saw Duke run into the house. Tomaso followed, concerned for the woman's welfare. Duke went to the second floor, calling out Eduardo, 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 creating, Tomaso later realized, a performance. Establishing for witnesses that she was shocked, grief-stricken, unaware of what had happened. The autopsy documented severe trauma consistent with being struck by a vehicle at high speed. The death certificate stated that the decedent was struck by an automobile while opening iron gates and then dragged under the vehicle. Except the physical evidence contradicted the official narrative. The gate damage was only to the lower rungs. Tirella's fatal injuries were to his upper body and head. He could not have been crushed against the gates and sustained those injuries. The blood and skin in the street, not at the gates, told the real story. 2 impacts. A pause between them. The second impact deliberate. Sergeant Newton compiled this evidence. He prepared to file a report recommending further investigation, possibly criminal charges. Then Newport Police Chief Joseph Richest took over the case. Newton's findings were buried. His theory about 2 impacts was excised from the official record. Within 5 days, the case would be closed. Within 7 months, Chief Richest would retire and purchase a condominium in Florida. But on the evening of October 7th, the truth was still visible, in the torn gravel, in the blood on Bellevue Avenue, in the gate damage that didn't match the story, in the autopsy findings that contradicted the official version. The house had witnessed everything. Rough Point stood as it had stood for 74 years solid, permanent, indifferent to the violence that had occurred at its entrance. The walls held their secrets. The gates would be replaced. The gravel would be raked smooth. But the truth remained, buried in evidence that most people would never see. Chapter 6. The Paperboy Who Saw Everything. Bob Walker carried the truth for 55 years. It weighed on him in ways he didn't fully understand until he was much older. He had been 13. A paperboy, a kid who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, or perhaps the right place at the right time, depending on how you measured these things. He was pedaling his 10-speed bicycle, delivering the Newport Daily News when the sounds reached him. Arguing first, 2 voices raised in anger, then the mechanical roar of an engine pushed too hard, the crash of metal on metal, a man's scream. Walker pedalled faster, drawn toward the commotion the way 13-year-olds are drawn toward anything unusual. The sounds continued. A slight skidding, a deceleration, the engine noise dropping, then a pause, brief but distinct, a moment of near silence, then the man's voice again, screaming, the horror in that sound unmistakable even to a kid who had never heard anything like it before. The roar of the engine rising again, louder this time, deliberate, the scream forming a word. The final crash, then silence. Walker arrived at Bellevue Avenue to find a crowd beginning to form. The station wagon was against a tree. Someone was beneath it. A woman stood near the vehicle, blood on her face, moving strangely. Walker got closer. He blurted out what he saw. "There's a guy under there. There's somebody under there." Doris Duke looked at him. Then she moved to position her body between Walker and the car, blocking his view. When he offered to help, to call the police, she screamed at him, "Leave! Get out of here! Go!" Walker rode home. He was shaking. He told his father what he had heard, the sequence of sounds, the 2 crashes, the pause between them, the way the man's scream changed from pain to terror. His father listened. Then he gave his son instructions that would shape the next 5 decades of Walker's life. You do not tell anyone what you heard. You do not go to the police. Doris Duke is not a woman you cross. She has people who work for her, people who would hurt you. Promise me you'll stay silent, Walker promised, and he kept that promise. He grew up. He joined the Marine Corps, served his country, became a veteran. He built a life. He had his own family. But he never forgot what he heard on Bellevue Avenue. The pause, the second roar of the engine, the word no. In 2021, Walker was 68 years old. He read a book by a journalist named Peter Lance, Homicide at Rough Point. The book laid out evidence that Eduardo Tirella's death was not an accident, but murder. It detailed Sergeant Newton's suppressed findings. It documented the two-impact theory Tirella struck once, going onto the hood, then struck again after falling off, deliberately run over. Walker realised that what he had heard 55 years earlier matched exactly what Newton had concluded: the pause, the second impact, the deliberation. He contacted Lance. They met in Newport. For the first time in his life, Bob Walker told someone outside his family what he had heard that evening in October of 1966. Lance interviewed him. The interview was recorded, later published by Vanity Fair. Walker described the sounds in sequence: the argument, the first crash, the deceleration, the pause, the scream resuming, the second acceleration, the final crash. His testimony corroborated Newton's forensic findings. It provided independent evidence that Duke had struck Tirella twice, with a pause between impacts. It suggested that the first impact might have been impulsive, rage-driven, but the second was calculated. Duke stopped. She could have stopped permanently. She could have gotten out, called for help. Instead, she accelerated again and finished what she had started. Walker's testimony changed the case. The Newport Police Department assigned Detective Jack West to reopen the investigation. West interviewed Walker formally. She interviewed Officer Angel, now retired. She reviewed the evidence Lance had compiled, but Walker had not gone to police in 1966 for a reason his father understood perfectly: power protects itself. The rich operate under different rules. A 13-year-old paperboy who contradicted Doris Duke's version of events would not receive justice. He would receive retaliation. Walker's father had been right. In 1966, truth was a luxury that working-class families could not afford. Speaking up meant risking everything: jobs, safety, the future. So Walker stayed silent. And because he stayed silent, Doris Duke's official story held for decades. The police closed the case in 5 days. Duke was never charged. Tirella was buried in Dover, New Jersey, his family receiving sympathy but not justice. The system that should have protected truth instead buried it. Chief Radis took over from Sergeant Newton. Newton's findings were excised. A fabricated transcript was created, giving the appearance that Duke had been properly interviewed when she had not. The case was closed without an inquest, based entirely on Duke's word. 8 days after the case closed, Duke began donating money to Newport institutions, $25,000 to restore the cliff walk, larger sums to follow. Over the coming years, she would save more than 80 colonial buildings from demolition, spend millions on historic preservation, transform Newport into a carefully maintained tourist destination. The donations bought silence. They bought gratitude. They bought the benefit of doubt from a city that understood that wealth must be respected, that questioning the richest woman in America carried risks no one wanted to take. Bob Walker understood this in 2021 in ways he could not have understood at 13. He understood that his silence had been complicity, not by choice, but by circumstance. He had been a child in a situation where children have no power. His father had protected him the only way he knew how, by teaching him that some truths are too dangerous to tell. But Walker also understood that time changes calculations. Doris Duke was dead. Chief Radis was dead. The people who had protected Duke, who had buried evidence, who had rewritten the official record, most of them were gone. and Eduardo Tirella's family, especially his niece Donna Lohmeyer, were still seeking acknowledgement that what happened to their uncle was not an accident. Walker's testimony gave them that acknowledgement. It gave the historical record a witness to what really occurred. It could not bring criminal charges against a woman 3 decades dead, but it could correct the narrative. It could restore Eduardo Tirella's reputation, make clear that he was a victim, not a casualty of his own carelessness. For 55 years, the house had known. Rough Point had witnessed what happened at its gates. The physical evidence had been there all along the gravel, the gate damage, the autopsy findings, the blood in the street. But evidence requires witnesses willing to speak. Bob Walker finally spoke, and in speaking, he confirmed what Sergeant Newton had known within hours of the incident. Doris Duke had killed Eduardo Tirella deliberately. She had struck him twice. She had paused between impacts. She had chosen to finish what she started. The truth had been waiting for someone brave enough to say it out loud. Chapter 7. The Investigation That Wasn't. The investigation lasted 5 days. In that time, Newport Police Chief Joseph Richest closed a case that should have taken months. No inquest, no grand jury, no thorough examination of the physical evidence that contradicted Doris Duke's account. Just 5 days from death to exoneration, October 8th. The Newport Daily News headline read, "Doris Duke kills friend in crash." The story was front page. A billionaire heiress, an employee crushed beneath her car. Questions about what happened at those gates. The public wanted answers. October 9th. The headline changed Dr. Barr's quizzing of Doris Duke. Duke had hired the assistant county medical examiner as her personal physician shortly before he arrived at Newport Hospital. When he came to treat her facial injuries, everything she told him was already protected by doctor-patient privilege. State investigators who wanted to question her that night were turned away. The medical examiner had just become Duke's employee. The conflict of interest was obvious. It didn't matter. October 10th. The case was officially closed, though newspapers would continue covering the story for days. Death of Miss Duke's friend ruled unfortunate accident. 3 days after Eduardo Tirella died, before any serious investigation could be completed, the Newport Police Department made its determination. Chief Richest based the conclusion entirely on Duke's version of events. She said the car leapt forward. She said she hit the brake but accidentally pressed the gas. She said Tirella was crushed against the gates. The physical evidence told a different story. Sergeant Fred Newton had documented it. The tyre gouges in the gravel showing heavy acceleration. The gate damage to lower rungs only. The blood and skin in the street, not at the gates. The autopsy showing fatal injuries to upper body and head. 2 distinct impact points. Newton's findings were suppressed. Chief Richest ordered him to excise the truth from his official report. Newton, a career officer without the rank or influence to resist, complied. His forensic analysis disappeared. The case moved forward based on Duke's word alone. October 12th. More headlines. Tirella death ruled accidental. Cops closed Duke accident case. The Newport Police Department announced it was finished investigating. No criminal charges would be filed. The case was closed. October 13th. Duke fatality case closed by police. October 15th. 8 days after Eduardo Tirella died. Doris Duke wrote a check for $25,000 to restore the cliff walk. The donation made front-page news. Doris Duke gives $25,000 to restore cliff walk. The article praised her generosity, her commitment to Newport, her desire to preserve the city's natural beauty. The transformation had begun. The woman who had just killed her employee was becoming Newport's greatest benefactor. Peter Lance, investigating the case 52 years later, found the fabricated transcript. It was filed with the official records, purporting to be an interview between Chief Richest and Doris Duke, questions and answers typed neatly, Duke's signature at the bottom. The document appeared legitimate until Lance examined it closely. Duke had corrected her own birth date on the transcript. The police had written November 23rd. Duke crossed it out, wrote November 22nd. If this had been an actual interview with a stenographer present, the error would have been corrected in real time and reflected in the typed record. The correction proved the interview never happened. Lance discovered how the document was created. Chief Radis had approached Duke's lawyer, Aram Arabian, and said he needed something to close the case. Arabian suggested the police write something up. They did. A script of questions and answers that made it appear Duke had been properly interrogated. They presented it to her to sign. She signed it, correcting the birth date error, and it went into the official file. The fabrication gave Radis what he needed, documentation that looked legitimate enough to satisfy anyone who didn't examine it too carefully. The case could be closed with the appearance of due diligence. 7 months later, Chief Radis retired from the Newport Police Department. He later purchased the first of 2 condominium units in Hollywood, Florida. Radis had connections to organized crime, relationships that would raise questions about why he closed the Duke case so quickly and so completely. The donations continued. Over the following months, Duke gave hundreds of thousands of dollars to Newport institutions. In 1968, she founded the Newport Restoration Foundation. Over the next decades, she would save more than 80 colonial-era buildings from demolition. She transformed the city's historic district, spending millions on restoration work that made Newport a premier tourist destination. The work was real. The buildings she saved were legitimately significant. The craftsmanship and care that went into the restorations were first-rate, but the timing made it clear this was blood money. 8 days after getting away with murder, Doris Duke began buying gratitude. Newport accepted her money. The city needed it. Tourism was becoming the economic engine, and Duke's preservation work created the product that tourists came to see: historic houses, colonial architecture, a carefully maintained vision of American history. The price was silence. The bargain was implicit, but understood. Duke's money flowed into Newport. Questions about what happened at Rough Point's gates faded. Eduardo Tirella was buried in Dover, New Jersey. His family grieved, and the official story became fact through repetition. Doris Duke had killed a man. The physical evidence proved it. Witnesses had heard 2 impacts. Sergeant Newton had documented the forensics, but Chief Radis closed the case in 5 days, and the truth disappeared into archives that few people would ever access. The system had worked exactly as designed. Wealth bought protection. The right lawyers, the right connections, the right donations applied in the right places, and accountability evaporated. Eduardo Tirella was dead, Doris Duke was free, and Newport had a new benefactor. Chapter 8: The $5,620 Settlement. Eduardo Tirella was the youngest of 9 children, 5 sisters, 3 brothers. They grew up in Dover, New Jersey, working-class Italian-American family. The kind of people who understood that $43,000 a year was extraordinary money, that losing someone with that earning capacity meant losing decades of support for aging parents, for nieces and nephews, for the extended family network that kept people afloat. When Eduardo died, the family wanted justice. They wanted criminal charges. They wanted Doris Duke held accountable for what she had done. The Newport Police Department closed the case in 5 days and told them it was an accident. The family knew better. They were willing to settle. According to later testimony, the Tirella family would have accepted $200,000 for 8 siblings to split, $25,000 each, a fraction of what Eduardo would have earned over the next 2 decades, a fraction of what he was worth, but it would have been something. It would have been acknowledgement. Doris Duke refused. She was making $1 million per week in interest on her fortune. $200,000 was what she spent on furniture. The Tirella family's settlement demand was a rounding error in her wealth. She refused anyway. The family had no choice. They filed a wrongful death civil suit. The case went to trial in the summer of 1971, 5 years after Eduardo's death, Providence Superior Courthouse, the same building where Klaus von Bülow's second trial would later take place. The trial lasted 10 days. The family asked for $1,250,000. Eduardo had been 42 when he died. He had earned $43,000 the year before, the equivalent of $355,000 in modern currency. He had more than 2 decades of earning capacity ahead of him. The calculation was straightforward. Duke's attorney was Aram Arabian, a Rhode Island lawyer with a reputation for ruthless tactics. Peter Lance would later call him the Roy Cohn of New England. Arabian's strategy was to destroy Eduardo Tirella's reputation. If the jury could be convinced that Tirella was somehow responsible for his own death, or that he was worth less than his family claimed, the damages would drop. Arabian besmirched Tirella throughout the trial, questioned his character, suggested his lifestyle made him unreliable, portrayed him as someone who had been lucky to work for Duke, not someone whose expertise Duke had valued. The tactic worked. Duke herself testified. She admitted she always asked Eduardo's advice before buying or planning anything for her estates. She acknowledged he had counselled her on art purchases worth tens of millions. She confirmed they had travelled together to London, Paris, Italy more than 100 occasions. Her own testimony established how valuable Tirella had been to her. But Arabian's character assassination had done its work. The jury found Duke criminally negligent. They awarded damages, but the amount was $75,000. The figure was later reduced further with Duke's lawyer's assistance. After legal fees and expenses, each of Tirella's 8 siblings received $5,620. Donna Lohmeyer, Eduardo's niece, would say years later Doris Duke killed Eddie twice. She destroyed his body and then she eviscerated his memory. The trial had lasted 10 days. Duke had forced the family to fight for 5 years. She had spent more on her legal defence than the family was asking for in settlement, and in the end, each sibling received an amount that wouldn't cover 1 year of community college tuition. Duke returned to her estates. She continued collecting art. She continued her preservation work in Newport. She added more properties to her holdings. Her wealth continued to grow. The Tirella family went back to New Jersey. They had Eduardo's memory. They had $5,620 each. They had the knowledge that the legal system had failed them as completely as the criminal justice system had. But there was one person Doris Duke did trust, a lover named Peter Byrne. They lived together at Falcon Lair in Los Angeles, the estate that had once belonged to Rudolph Valentino. Byrne was decades younger than Duke. They were, by his account, inseparable. Falcon Lair was near the home where Sharon Tate and 4 others had been murdered by Charles Manson's followers in August of 1969. 3 years after Eduardo Tirella died, the proximity was coincidental. The violence was not in the intimacy of that relationship, in the privacy of a house where Duke felt safe. She told Byrne the truth. She told him that Eduardo Tirella got what he deserved when she drove her car into him. Not an accident, not a tragedy, not a mistake or a moment of panic or a mechanical failure. Deserved. Peter Byrne, in his 90s when he finally spoke to journalist Peter Lance, remembered Duke's words clearly. She had confessed to murder, she had admitted intent, and she had framed it as justified. Tirella had tried to leave her. He had chosen his Hollywood career over her. He had valued his own ambitions more than her needs, and for that, he deserved to die. The richest woman in America had confessed to murder, and she believed she had the right to kill a man who dared to leave her. Byrne's testimony transformed the case. It was no longer circumstantial evidence and disputed forensics. It was Duke's own words, spoken to someone she trusted, admitting what she had done and why. The confession would not surface publicly until 2021, when Lance published it in the Santa Barbara News Press. By then, Duke had been dead for 28 years. Criminal charges were impossible, but the historical record could be corrected. Eduardo Tirella's family could know that their uncle had been murdered, that the truth had been buried, that Duke had gotten away with it. The confession also explained why Duke had fought the civil suit so hard. It wasn't about the money. She could have settled for millions and never noticed the expense. It was about control, admitting liability, even in a civil case, meant admitting she had been wrong, and Doris Duke did not admit to being wrong. She paid $5,620 per sibling rather than acknowledge that Eduardo Tirella's death was anything other than an unfortunate accident. She let her lawyer destroy his reputation in court. She sat through 10 days of testimony and maintained the fiction. Then, in private, with a lover she believed would never betray her confidence, she told the truth. Eduardo got what he deserved. The confession was the final piece of evidence. It confirmed what Sergeant Newton's forensics had shown, what Bob Walker had heard, what the physical evidence at the scene had demonstrated. Doris Duke had killed Eduardo Tirella deliberately. She had struck him twice, with a pause between impacts, and she had spent the next 27 years of her life pretending it was an accident. Chapter 9. Rough Point's Reckoning. Doris Duke died on October 28, 1993, at Falcon Lair in Los Angeles. She was 80 years old. The cause was progressive pulmonary edema resulting in cardiac arrest. Her estate was valued at $1.2 billion, the equivalent of $2.3 billion in modern currency. She left the bulk of her fortune to charity. The Doris Duke Charitable Foundation would distribute grants for medical research, child welfare, the performing arts, environmental conservation. Her Manhattan mansion became a museum. Duke Farms in New Jersey opened to the public as an environmental education center. Shangri-La in Hawaii became a center for Islamic art studies. And Rough Point went to the Newport Restoration Foundation, the organization Duke had founded in 1968. The bequest specified that the house should be preserved exactly as she had left it. Nothing removed, nothing changed. The art collection, the furniture, the decorative objects, even her personal effects remained in place. The foundation faced immediate questions. What to do about Eduardo Tirella? The death had happened at Rough Point. It was part of the house's history. But it complicated the narrative Duke had spent decades constructing: the philanthropist, the preservationist, the woman who had saved Newport's architectural heritage. The museum opened to the public in 2000, 7 years after Duke's death. Visitors walked through rooms filled with Ming Dynasty porcelain, Renoir paintings, furniture from the Palace of Versailles. They saw Duke's desk in the solarium, positioned to overlook the Atlantic. They learned about her travels, her collecting, her commitment to preserving beauty. And in one small section, they encountered an exhibit about October 7th, 1966. The original exhibit, displayed from 2000 to 2021, called it an accident. 5 paragraphs explaining that Doris Duke and her interior designer were leaving Rough Point when a tragic accident occurred. Eduardo Tirella was killed. The police investigated. They determined it was an unfortunate accident. Duke was devastated. The family eventually settled with her. Every sentence was calculated. The word accident appeared multiple times. The claim that the family settled implied mutual agreement, closure, acceptance. The exhibit omitted crucial facts: that Duke had been found criminally negligent in the 1971 trial, that the settlement came only after 5 years of litigation, that each sibling received $5,620. It was a whitewash, polite, respectful to Duke's memory, utterly dishonest. The exhibit remained unchanged for 21 years. Tour guides answered questions about the incident with the same sanitized version. Some visitors accepted it. Others, especially locals who remembered the rumors from 1966, recognized it as fiction. Then, in February of 2021, Peter Lance published Homicide at Rough Point. The book presented evidence that Eduardo Tirella's death was murder. It included Sergeant Newton's suppressed forensics, the fabricated police transcript, Bob Walker's eyewitness testimony, and Peter Burns' account of Duke's confession. In March, NBC 10. News in Rhode Island aired a 4-part series on Lance's findings. The coverage reached a wide audience. People who had never heard of Eduardo Tirella learned his story. People who had assumed the accident narrative was true discovered they had been lied to. Donna Lohmeyer, Eduardo's niece, contacted the Newport Restoration Foundation. She informed them that the museum exhibit contained inaccuracies. She requested that they be corrected or removed. The exhibit, she said, was false and disrespectful to her uncle. The foundation changed the exhibit. The revision appeared sometime in 2021, after Lance's book and the NBC series made ignoring the evidence impossible. The new version reduced the text from 5 paragraphs to 4. It changed the word accident to incident. It eliminated the false claim that the family had settled with Duke in a way that suggested agreement. But it still omitted critical facts. It didn't mention that Duke had been found criminally negligent. It didn't mention the 2 impact forensics. It didn't mention that Duke and Tirella were going to examine the reliquary of St. Ursula, not to dinner as the exhibit claimed. The revision was improvement. It was not truth. Visitors touring Rough Point in 2021 noticed the change. Chris Fisher, visiting from Tucson, said, "I think there's a lot more to the story than they're letting on." William Fisher, from Florida. They can't brush it under the rug entirely. Karen House, from Maryland. I don't know. Can you forgive murder? It's kind of a big question. The foundation that Duke created to preserve Newport's history was now struggling with preserving an accurate account of her own. The mansion had become both museum and monument. It celebrated Duke's achievements while minimizing her crimes. Visitors could admire the art she collected while walking past the gates where she killed a man. The house itself remained what it had always been witness. The walls held their secrets. The solarium still overlooked the ocean. The entrance hall still rose 2 stories. The gates had been replaced decades earlier, but the location remained. Bellevue Avenue, the cliff edge, the point where Eduardo Tirella died. Rough Point had survived Duke by 3 decades. It would survive longer still. The coral foundation would hold. The granite walls would weather salt air for another century. The Olmsted Gardens would continue growing. The house was permanent in ways that people are not. But permanence carried obligation. The house had witnessed murder. It could not speak, but it could preserve, and preserved within its walls, within its archives, within the memories of people who knew the truth, was evidence that contradicted the sanitized version on display. The foundation faced a choice: continue minimizing what happened, or acknowledge the full truth. Preservation meant more than maintaining buildings. It meant maintaining honesty about what those buildings had witnessed. The mansion waited. It had waited 55 years for Bob Walker to speak. It had waited 28 years for Peter Byrne's confession to surface. It could wait longer still for the Newport Restoration Foundation to tell the complete story of what happened at its gates. Chapter 10, Case Reopened. In August of 2021, the Newport Police Department announced it was reopening the Eduardo Tirella investigation. Detective Jacques West was assigned to review the case. The decision came after Bob Walker's testimony and the publication of Peter Lance's book made clear that the original investigation had been inadequate. Detective West released a statement. The Newport Police Department would like to look further into this due to the new information we've been given, and rectify any possible misinformation concluded in the past, if any, for Eduardo and his family. The qualified language was notable: any possible misinformation, if any. The statement acknowledged problems without admitting wrongdoing, but it represented progress. For the first time in 55 years, the Newport Police Department was willing to reconsider what happened. West conducted interviews. On September 17th, 2021, at 7 o'clock in the evening, she recorded an interview with Edward Angel, now retired. Angel had been the first officer at the scene in 1966. He described what he had found: the body beneath the car, the damaged gates, the tyre marks indicating the vehicle had come from inside the property. West reviewed the evidence Lance had compiled, the autopsy report showing injuries inconsistent with being crushed against gates, the photographs of gate damage to lower rungs only, the fabricated police transcript, Bob Walker's account of hearing 2 distinct impacts with a pause between them. The reopened investigation lasted 5 months. Then, on November 24, 2021, the Newport Police Department closed the case again. The announcement was brief, no evidence to change the verdict. The official finding remained unfortunate accident. The headline in Newport this week read, "Newport Police closed Doris Duke case. Again." The decision provoked immediate outrage. City Council members who had been following the investigation spoke publicly. Kate Leonard, who had served on the council for more than 20 years, said, "I have never seen such a mishandling of a case by a detective who had so much evidence in front of her, disproving the accident story." Council member Elizabeth Fuerte added, "It is our role to ensure that the process is followed and no stone was left unturned. If there was a cover-up, that too must be exposed and announced. We owe it to this generation. It is our right to know the entire truth." Michael Henry Adams, a historic preservationist, released a statement. "As a historic preservationist, I was totally disposed to believe the best about Doris Duke. But Peter Lance's Vanity Fair article and book convinced me that Eduardo Tirella was murdered. Doris Duke did it, and police corruptly covered up her crime. The pattern had repeated itself. In 1966, Chief Radice closed the case in 5 days, despite forensic evidence of murder. In 2021, Detective West closed it again in 5 months, despite eyewitness testimony, confession evidence, and documented proof that the original investigation was fabricated. The system protected itself. Admitting that the 1966 investigation was corrupt meant admitting that the Newport Police Department had covered up a murder for 55 years. It meant acknowledging that Chief Radice had taken money, or favours, or pressure from Doris Duke or her representatives. It meant confronting institutional failure that spanned generations. Easier to close the case again, claim insufficient evidence, move on. But the historical record had changed. Wikipedia now included an entire section on the death of Eduardo Tirella, based on Lance's findings. Academic researchers studying Doris Duke's life now treated the murder as fact, not allegation. The official police record said accident. Everyone else said murder. Doris Duke died in 1993. She could not be criminally charged. Eduardo Tirella died in 1966. He could not receive justice. The legal system had failed both times. It had the opportunity to hold Duke accountable. But truth operated on different timelines than justice. The truth had emerged slowly, Sergeant Newton's suppressed findings, discovered decades later, Bob Walker's testimony, given 55 years after the fact, Peter Byrne's account of Duke's confession, revealed after both Duke and Byrne were elderly. The accumulation of evidence built a case that could not be prosecuted, but could not be denied. Doris Duke murdered Eduardo Tirella. She struck him twice with her car. She paused between impacts. She chose to finish what she started. Then she used her wealth to buy immunity from consequences. Rough Point Museum continued operating. April through November, tourists walked through the mansion, admired the art, learned about Duke's life and work. Tour guides still fielded questions about October 7th, 1966. The answers they gave now included acknowledgement that the case was disputed, that some people believed it was murder, that the truth might never be fully known. The uncertainty was dishonest. The truth was knowable. It had been known since October 7th, 1966, when Sergeant Newton examined the scene and concluded that Eduardo Tirella had been deliberately killed. What remained unknown was whether the Newport Police Department would ever officially acknowledge what its own investigator had determined 55 years earlier. The house stood on its cliff. The Atlantic crashed against the rocks. The gardens grew according to Olmsted's plan. Inside, Duke's collection remained precisely as she had arranged it. The mansion was preserved. Eduardo Tirella's memory was still being fought over. The final chapter of Rough Point's story had not been written. Perhaps it never would be. Perhaps the house would stand for another century, holding its secrets, waiting for someone with enough authority to correct the record. Or perhaps the record would remain as it was officially an accident, truthfully a murder, forever disputed, because admitting the truth required admitting that wealth had purchased immunity from a crime committed in public view. Rough Point Museum opens its doors each April. Tourists arrive from around the world to see Doris Duke's collection, Ming Dynasty porcelain arranged in glass cases, Renoir paintings on silk-covered walls, furniture that once filled rooms at the Palace of Versailles. The art is museum quality. The house is maintained to exacting standards. The grounds remain as Olmsted designed them. Lawns slope toward the cliff edge. Gardens feature plantings chosen for how they respond to salt air and coastal winds. Paths wind through the property, offering views of the Atlantic. Tour guides lead groups through the entrance hall, the great room, up to the second-floor bedrooms. They point out details: the carved wood, the leaded glass, the antique tiles. They tell stories about Duke's travels, her collecting habits, her commitment to preservation. They also tell stories about Princess and Baby. In the late 1980s, Doris Duke acquired 2 Bactrian camels. The animals came as part of a Boeing 737 purchase, an eccentric addition to an already eccentric life. Duke kept them at Rough Point during her summer residences. She fed them peanut butter cookies in large quantities. Tourists walking the cliff walk would see the camels and stop, delighted by the unexpected sight. During Hurricane Bob in 1991, Duke sheltered Princess and Baby in the solarium. The 40-foot glass room, designed to showcase orchids and ocean views, became temporary housing for 2 humped camels. The image was absurd and memorable. Tour guides still mention the camels. Visitors remember them. The whimsical detail overshadows darker history. People who tour Rough Point recall seeing the solarium where camels once stood. They remember the story about peanut butter cookies. They forget, or never learn, about the man who died at the gates. The paradox is perfect. Doris Duke spent millions preserving Newport's colonial architecture. She saved more than 80 buildings from demolition. She transformed the historic district into a carefully maintained showcase of American history. The Newport Restoration Foundation, which she founded, continues that work today. But she could not preserve Eduardo Tirella's life, and the foundation she created cannot bring itself to preserve the full truth of what she did. Some visitors come to Rough Point specifically because they have heard about October 7th, 1966. They want to see where it happened. They walk down the driveway, stand near where the gates used to be, look toward Bellevue Avenue. They try to imagine the scene, the roar of the engine, the scream, the 2-ton station wagon accelerating from a dead stop. Most visitors come for the art. They spend their time admiring Duke's collection, marvelling at her taste, learning about her philanthropic work. The death gets mentioned briefly, if at all, an unfortunate incident, a tragic accident, the official language that obscures murder. The house knows better. Rough Point has stood for 133 years. It has witnessed 3 centuries. It has outlasted everyone who built it, everyone who lived in it, everyone who died near it. The walls hold evidence that cannot speak but cannot be erased. The gates were replaced decades ago. The tree that Eduardo Tirella's body was crushed against is gone, but the location remains. The point where the driveway meets Bellevue Avenue. The spot where blood was found in the street. The place where a man screamed no before a 2-ton wagon ran him down. Rough Point will stand for another century. The coral foundation will hold. The granite walls will endure. The Olmsted Gardens will grow. And somewhere in those walls, in the archives, in the memories of people who care about truth more than reputation, the full story of what happened on October 7th, 1966, will wait. The house refused to forget, and eventually neither did the paperboy, or the lover, or the journalist who put the pieces together. The truth took 55 years to surface, but it surfaced. Doris Duke believed her wealth could buy immunity. She was right for most of her life, but she could not buy permanent silence. Money cannot rewrite history forever. Eventually, Witnesses speak. Eventually, evidence emerges. Eventually, the truth matters more than the official story. The Atlantic crashes against the rocks. The mansion stands on its cliff, and if you listen carefully on October evenings, you might hear an echo. Not the waves, not the wind, something else. A voice, a word. No, Eduardo Tirella is still there. The house remembers.